Hello, I wanted to welcome my friends and technology philosopher and artist and community hero, Alex. We're going to be talking about responsibility around technology and the structure of technology, the way that media has been integrated into our lives, and some of the ways that we can, have some autonomy and control in that space. And I know that we'll go like a lot of places, but I really just wanted to start with like who you are, what you do, and what kind of got you interested in this.
Hi, so yeah, my name is Alex Ramos. I am an artist. Have been pretty much my entire life. I teach computer science to middle school and elementary school kids at a private school in Sugar Land. It's called the Wide School. WIDE, not white as in the color, but wide as in yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
W
I would love to start off our conversation by talking about the white school in Texas, like the
context. Yeah,
internet.
you got to be really careful with words. Yes, wide school. So,
White.
and I've been in technology for a while. I used to work for Apple. I worked for Apple for 5 years. Retail side, customer facing. So like the Genius Bar, helping customers with their devices and stuff like that, and then deploying software, and then testing software as well. So yeah, pretty early on, I started noticing that technology started evolving in a really dangerous way. I saw it at Apple. Started seeing kind of the uprising of the cult mentality or the hive mentality on the internet, and this was say about 2012 for me. I started around the time I was working at Apple. So yeah, just noticing social media growing exponentially, and Facebook, um, Instagram, and all of these different sites. Kind of just the way that we engage. I started noticing that we started engaging differently. People, humans, started, communicating differently. And as I started getting into the realm of teaching and teaching computer science, one of the core values that I really try to instill in my students is digital citizenship. So, like, what does that mean? When you're a digital citizen, because the places that we engage in, they're a new world. It's like a place that's different than the physical space that we occupy. But it might not be a tangible space, but it's a space that's real, and there's real interactions going on there, and there's real consequences. So yeah, I started reading a lot about social science in the tech industry, and then the way that we deal with our own psychology in the way that humans engage. And then whenever you add technology into that, I started reading books. There was a book that I read one of the first books. It's called We Are Not a Gadget by Jaron Lanier. He's a great thinker. He's the father of virtual reality. So he's been in the game for years. And he is a media theorist and amazing author that speaks about the influences of technology on the human. So started reading that, and then I started reading a book called The Cyber Effect. Mary Atkins or Akins, she's a clinical psychologist that does cyber psychology. So it's like how the psychology of humans interact with.
I love that.
It was the cover had, it was a hole with a rabbit jumping into it, and of course we all know, like,
Yeah.
YouTube, we go into this like YouTube rabbit hole, and you don't know where you'll emerge or with what information you'll emerge with. So I felt that way when I started reading this book. There were things that she was proposing, or at the time, and this was, early, it's about 2010, 2013, between those 3 years. It's when I really got interested in reading books about it. I'm an avid reader, so when I really started transitioning to reading, now that the technology is more, accessible, and we're able to see trends appear, authors are writing more about it. Futurists or philosophers are writing about the implications of technology. So yeah, it was really interesting to read these two books and start to open my eyes to the implications of the media that we consume. And
Yeah, I actually I don't know if I ever really conceptualized like digital citizenship until I heard that term from you. Like, I think a lot of us are kind of, because we're moving more away from books, and we've kind of like, you know, we love science and we love data, but the philosophy around it still has kind of a stigma because it's that woo woo gooey shit, which I think is where the real damage happens. And you also introduced me to an idea that I hadn't thought of before, which was what social media owes us for the work that we do for social media companies. And that really, like, I know that like, learning more about it now, I kind of understand it, but that's a huge paradigm shift for me, because we always think of how, you know, like, if you're not paying for it, you're the product. And so I wanted you to maybe talk about like the difference between, you know, the paradigm that we were living in before, you know, how we interact with products, and the money that social media is making off of us.
Okay, yeah, that's a big question. We
Yeah, just
got
like
2 hours.
fucking go, machine gun.
2 hours. So yeah, well, before we can even answer those questions about like the how, what is social media? Because it's a social media. My partner says it's catchy packaging. The word that they use, social media, it's just a word that we've used to kind of introduce an idea or a concept. So it's sort of misleading, right? When you really think about it. So before we even answer those questions, really got to understand like what got us here. So, and this goes back to even before technology was even readily available or was even a concept in people's minds. When we industrialized work, when we transitioned to like the assembly line, you know, this idea that you could program entire societies to function in a specific way, understanding the psychology behind creating society. You know, so when the Industrial Revolution happened, they realized that they could break down labor to basic functions that a human could repetitively do over and over. And really the growth of machines happened, right? Automation, and these concepts and these ideas, which were revolutionary for their time, you know, and completely revolutionized the way or American economy worked, the global economy. So it almost was like the beginnings of stripping our humanity away, right? And these big companies started to grow out of there, you know, to make labor cheap. And it actually, a lot of people will argue that it helped the middle class, right? And it did, like it really did. There was a huge increase in quality of life, right? So these systems that were put in place kind of affected the way that we function in society on the internet, or the way that social media kind of has played out. So the economy that social media has is, we've all heard it, advertisement model. So that's their business model. The business model is to create advertisement, and that's their revenue, and then they feed it to you. So they tell an advertiser, hey advertiser, we've got people go on our site, millions and billions of, you know, clicks a day, so much traffic going through our site, so pay us and we'll advertise to them. And I mean, that's not wrong. I mean, people have been doing that for years.
Yeah, capitalizing on web traffic is like that's one of the first things they did. Like, oh, I have visitors to my website, so this is how much your ad is worth.
Exactly. So that economic model sounds pretty sound. Like you're like, okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But the thing that we don't get to see that's happening is the way that these algorithms are so smart. They're so quick, and their pattern recognition. They are finding threads that we could have never connected. They're able to quantify every aspect of our interaction with the internet and a level that we could never comprehend, right? As humans, we can't compute that amount of information at the same time. So what ends up happening is when we're led to believe that it's about ads, and people, you know, I say it to myself too, it's like, I can ignore an ad. I can put up an ad blocker and just whatever, I don't see the ad. The reason why we're led to believe that, and it's so easy to just use advertisement as a scapegoat, is because, you know, it's almost like we take control. Like that's the control I have, that, oh yeah, I can just like do away with it. And it's a scapegoat. Like it's never been about the advertisements. You know, the advertisements are one stream of revenue What it really comes down to is what data they're collecting and the way that the algorithms work to connect that data and parse information about us that we would have never known could be siphoned out, right? And then the information that they use no longer becomes like, oh, we're going to advertise to people who like sneakers. It's like what it comes down to is like they'll start to use this data to manipulate entire communities. So the way that we engage on the internet now has become so what's the word? It's everywhere. It's in our cars. It's on our TVs. I forget the word. I'm really high right now.
Is it ubiquitous?
Ubiquitous. There you go. It's become ubiquitous.
I love it when I can guess a word without like hardly any context clues,
Right? You're like, it's a word. It sounds like
everywhere.
Yeah, so it's ubiquitous. Facebook, these social media giants, data mining companies. They're not social media. They're data mining companies. They are in everything. They're on our fridge. The software that these companies use is the same. They use the same infrastructure, same servers. And they're collecting mass amounts of data. And the more data you have about a community, the easier it is to target the most vulnerable, right? Not the guy who can ignore things, and it's not about selling you things. It's about changing your ideology, changing the environment. And that's what ends up happening. These social media algorithms utilize sensational headlines, clickbaity verbiage to attack our weakest, like the weakest parts of our minds, right?
Yeah.
So they trigger you at an emotional level because they have the data. They are constantly recording our facial expressions, the tone of our voice. So algorithms that can understand pitch and then get that information out of hundreds of conversations that you've had and know when you're angry or when you're sad. They're able to understand how fast you scroll or click, your mouse movement, things that you're like, well, why does that matter? Well, individually, certain data doesn't matter. Like, it's like, if I could have how fast you move your mouse, that doesn't mean anything on its own. But when you have so much data about that human being, these companies could essentially predict medical issues like Parkinson's, early onset Parkinson's, by being able to parse out this data, and then that brings up questions like, morally, should they alert a human if they have an algorithm that could tell if the person has early onset dementia or Alzheimer's, because of the way that they've engaged with this and with their devices? And a lot of times they don't care about that kind of stuff. They would rather make a buck by, tipping off the insurance companies and saying, hey, you might want to kick this person off because they're going to become a huge medical liability. And then they cut your benefits, and that's what ends up happening. They are manipulating the information that we're freely giving them. Like, I'm working my ass off, carrying around a phone, charging it every day, like working on my computer. I'm utilizing their infrastructure. I'm kind of forced to, there is no way out of it. So I'm working the system. I'm creating the environment. I am the infrastructure of Facebook. Without the user, there would be no Facebook, so in a way they're capitalizing on our work, taking this, and then they're manipulating our reality. So we're stuck in this bubble that essentially is being controlled by the information that they spread through social media, the way that the algorithms understand us at a deep level we can't understand ourselves. And then they're able to target us 24/7 right to your pocket, and then what do? They radicalize certain individuals. They target. YouTube does that with their suggestion algorithm. It's always just one step further the fringe, one step closer to like the Alex Jones or the like just radicalizing people more and more. And they do that to children, and they're doing it and it's unregulated and there's no way to monitor, and they're making billions. Like we we herald them as these like great tycoons and giants of their industry, but if we look at it, they're making it off the backs of every individual that's on the internet.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered some of.
No, it totally does. Like, I think like what you said about how people, they've kind of been trained to believe that they have control over the advertisements that come into their digital space, but really we're not only being advertised to, we're also being influenced. So it's not just about like some like an ad popping up. It's about the fact that like all of our behavior is being recorded, and then that recorded behavior is being used to influence the way that we behave online. And it trickles. I think what I'm really, I think it's important to have experts in every area, but like for me, like data rights is important, but the way that we're treating each other in the midst of what I believe is like a war on the individual, like the way that we're treating the people that we're in battle with has been like really not up to par. And so like I wondered if you could speak on maybe some of the ways that like our behavior of being reactionary and like being in conflict. I know that we've spoken before about like some of the symptoms of trauma and how that manifests. Like, do you have any experience with what it's like to try to get this kind of message out?
A lot. I'm glad you used data rights as human rights, and that's something that I really advocate for. And I get a lot of blank stares. They're like, "What are you talking about?" Like, people don't really understand what I mean by when I say data rights or human rights. Yeah, and before I'm able to answer the second part of your question, I wanted to touch on one thing about how these algorithms or how these social media companies actually manipulate that data, like what's actually going on in the back end. And what we don't realize is all the data that they collect, they're creating a digital version of each human being on the planet that uses their infrastructure. You don't even have to actually physically be on Facebook or use Google. Just by getting on the internet, the information is being used to kind of triangulate the best version of you. And then every time you get on, you're training this algorithm to create this digital version of you that understands you. And then they're able to quantify patterns about your behavior. And that's where the trauma comes in. And that's where like the psychology behind it, like where if you are a person who has dealt with trauma before, and you're stuck in that emotional state where you haven't processed some of that residual trauma from your childhood, you end up becoming, like you said, reactionary. So what ends up happening is these algorithms are using that information, the way that you react to certain headlines, to certain keywords. It's like, for example, I say a word, let's say the word love. So right now, we all know the textbook definition of love, but when I say the word love, I process that word differently than you would. It processes through all of the types of love that you've received, or the types of books that you've read on love, or the movies that you watch, or the ways that you've experienced it in your life. And now that definition becomes very unique, and it becomes personal. And our ideologies then manifest from those identities that we've created through our entire programming. From the moment you were born to today, you have been programmed with a certain set of values, ideals, and every individual has their own personal story, and we live in a postmodern, hyper-individualist world where everyone is unique and everyone has value, and there's a lot of validity behind that. What that also does is it fragments ideologies down to the individual, and it erodes unity. So nobody can stand behind an individual cause. Add to that what we've been talking about, social media. So like, if we understand that about humans, that we are, almost trauma driven, we are trigger driven, we're reactionary, our impulses kind of
By design, like as protective measures, like it's not a bad thing.
Not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I just wanted to like frame that. Like, it's not that you're bad or wrong for having trauma or trauma reactions. Like that's part of who we are as human beings, is that we are programmed by our biology to react to triggers and to speak from trauma, because that experience is how we survive.
And to add to that, it's biological, like the way that the brain works, and the way that you process information. It's, whenever you see certain colors, your brain is trying to be as efficient as it can. When you see an image of something, a predator, it has to be reactionary. It has to like think quickly, and it's in our nature to act that way. Our brains process, and it's a highly efficient machine, that's optimizing for the quickest way to get you the things that you want, right? And what ends up happening is we become blinded because of that. Because there's so many blind spots. When the brain is hyper focused on something, it actually can be like physically and even and mentally blinded. And what ends up happening is you don't see a perspective outside of the one that you're currently focused on. And it creates tunnel vision. And that's where we get stuck in social media. I've been watching people whenever I pose these questions on social media. I watch these two sides just go at each other. And it is a breeding ground for that because there is no tone. We've stripped tone away. They've homogenized the structure of it. I don't know if you remember the days of MySpace. I mean, I used to write code on my MySpace page to make it all like fancy. Like it was very like individual. It was whatever. It was a free for all. Like there was no consistency really across the platform itself, the user interface. Facebook, it makes it, uniform, and that's a good architectural approach. Like when you think about creating a user interface and what's the quickest way to get them to do the things that we want, and when you think about that, like from a marketing standpoint, it makes sense, but from a psychological standpoint, when you think about the way that a user interface is programmed or it's created to manipulate where you go, the information that you're reading, the thing, and that there's a nefarious side to that could potentially be used to influence you. And when we get into these social media arguments, we're coming from a place of like we've been triggered. We read a word, we've processed it through our brains. Our brain is highly efficient. It's pulling up information quickly, trying to remember like, well, what are the things I know about this subject, and then we automatically start with a bias. Like I interpret this as, an attack on my identity, or a personal attack on me, or I'm trying to defend somebody who I think might be the target of this. And then we play the victim villain, game in this, like we don't seek to understand. And there's a breakdown in communication because people start calling each other names, and it erodes social discourse. There's no way to have a conversation on social media without, automatically being put into a checkbox. And this is who you are. You are a right-wing Republican, conservative, pro whatever, and then it's like the endless list of ideologies that then just get fragmented, and then people are just shouting at each other, and there's no unity within it. And it's actually inherent in the system. It's the way that it's built, because it's time on screen. It's how many eyes and how many hours a day can I keep your eyes on that screen? Mm-hmm. How many times can I keep you scrolling on Facebook? And it's an addictive behavior, because it does trigger dopamine and serotonin receptors in our brain. When we're triggered by certain things, there's a release of chemicals that your brain is like, I need this. Add to that the social validation. We're social creatures by nature. Another thing, like we are psychologically programmed to be social creatures, and our need for it is programmed and understood within these companies. And they understand that we seek that, and they monetize on it, and they gamify your need for validation, your human need. Like if there isn't anything that says human rights, like for you to manipulate my being, and people can say like, oh, well, I have control over, I'm autonomous, I'm a free individual. But when you really start to think about and meditate on the idea of what it is to be free and what it is to be autonomous, you realize the many years of programming that have led you to make the decisions you have that you had no control over.
Yeah. And I think like not to make it too much about personal trauma, but that aligns so I mean, almost perfectly with how personally, when we realize that we're being driven by trauma, the first thing we do is reject it, because we do want to believe that our choices are our own, you know? Like when I look back at when I was like a raging feminist on Facebook, like I believed the things I was saying. And I did believe that if I didn't say that to this, you know, fucking white guy in Virginia, that, you know, that was going to have an avalanche effect that, you know, literally killed women. And so my words were charged with that energy. And now that I understand, like, I'm safe in my body, like this person is just another human being, like, you know, when I remove the radicalization, you know, and I think there are some positive aspects to being radical, but, you know, when we remove the parts of us that are put into us from like an external manipulation, then we get to act with our true self. And that's so true for our personal narrative around, you know, healing our trauma, understanding what pieces are us and what are, you know, our parents' voice in our head or the media's voice in our head. So maybe like the other day I was looking through, I downloaded like the app for my bank, and I was, you know, trying to move some stuff around, and I just kept seeing a red dot that I couldn't get rid of. And then I noticed, you know, in Animal Crossing, they have little red dot notifications on my phone in Animal Crossing. And so like I was looking at the pattern of how like anywhere that a app puts a red dot, I am trained to just go investigate what that red dot is, because that means there's a notification somewhere and I have to read it. I get to the end of the rabbit hole in my fucking bank app and it's trying to sell me something. That's not notifying me anything. You know what I mean? Like it's not, but I am like a little rat in a maze going through that training. And so like now that I see that, I get to kind of shift my view. So like my question for you, I guess, would be like, how do you think that people can start like understanding data rights, understanding citizenship, digital citizenship, stuff like that? Like where is kind of like the rabbit hole that leads to, you know, the other side of this reality?
So everybody heralds technology for all of its greatness, and everybody has this utopian ideology about what technology is going to do for our world. It happened with DNA, right? We're going to map the human genome, and that's going to solve all of our problems. We're going to be the healthiest species ever because we're going to map the genome, and it mapped it, and nothing happened, right? So there's these things that we've told ourselves about technology, right? That it's gonna be change the world, and it's going to connect everybody, and the quality of life is just going to improve. And that's true. I'm not saying that that hasn't happened, and it hasn't brought people out of poverty across the world, and it does. And I'm not going to discount all of the great ways that it's connected us.
Yeah.
But there is definitely a part of it that we are ignoring because we're seeing it through those lenses, because we want it so bad. We as humans are very optimistic, so we want these things to be, and they are true. When I say, data rights are human rights, and that like these social media giants should change the way that they work and operate, I'm not saying that we should destroy them or get rid of them. I think that we need them, and they're amazing. The fact that we're able to talk across an entire city, on video and record it, and be able to communicate this message to people is amazing. And I love that, and that's the part that I want from it. But we cannot lie to ourselves that there's something going on behind closed doors that we're not aware of, that our data is being used in ways that we will never understand. And they're attacking people's primitive emotional humanity. They're targeting the part of them that they don't even understand. And they're doing it without any regulation. So the rabbit hole that it led me to really understanding what's going on is the way that these algorithms are being deployed to control entire society. So Facebook started this program called Free Basics. It's a free internet across the world to developing nations. One of those developing nations is the Philippines. So what was going on there is they would go to their elected officials and say, we have this program, help us fund it. We're going to get cell phones to everyone and access to the internet. But there's a stipulation: the only way that they're able to access the internet is through Facebook. So they were using, this was a while back, they were using the Philippines to deploy algorithms that they were developing on controlling human behavior.
So fucked up.
Extremely fucked up. So what they do is they take these algorithms, they take information from your location, your GPS location, they take who you're around, the people who are your closest influence, your conversations. They record your, if you're in emotional distress, and they take this information and then they run it through these algorithms, and they've got a map of this entire community of people. And then they are able to see where those weak links are, the people who are emotionally vulnerable and their connections, and then they target them relentlessly. And they were using these algorithms. I don't know if you've ever gotten off of Facebook and then like a few months later you come back in and you realize you've got like hundreds of messages from Facebook, like in your email saying like, hey, are you coming back? Like, and then they start notifying you like, hey, such and such person is doing this. Would you like to know about it? And you're like, why are they doing this? Is because they need you to be on their platform. And that's how they're making the money. And then what they do is they say to these countries, and it's not an advertiser, it's a country, like the government, and they say, hey, government, here is access to all of your citizens and their ideologies. It's like
That's terrifying.
It's terrifying. It really is. I mean, we think about Nazi Germany and the census that happened, and that's how they were able to round up people for their ideologies and their belief systems. And this was a system that when they were filling out these censuses, they didn't know what it was going to be used for. This plan hadn't even been revealed yet, So that's what ends up happening in these countries. And if you notice the government in the Philippines, they're committing genocide. They are killing people. They have the war on drugs that they've been fighting. It's really just like a witch hunt. Yeah. And they can kill anybody for saying, oh, he's a drug dealer. And there is no law prohibiting this from happening. And this is a government that utilized social media to radicalize their constituents, to radicalize their citizens, And what ended up happening is that like they turned citizens against each other. They created an entire ad campaign saying, hey, turn in your cousin might be a drug dealer, and they're going to rape somebody, you should turn them in. And they were going door to door, busting doors down. I was reading reports about that. And so where I get my information from, a lot of people are like, well, how do you know this is real? There's an organization, it's a nonprofit called the Center for Humane Technology. It's a big plug. I've been...
I'll put a link in the description too, because I've been sifting through and it's been a huge resource.
Yeah, it's a great resource. They have a podcast. It's Your Undivided Attention. They're the head of this organization. His name is Tristan Harris. He's a great thinker, philosopher of our time that really has presented this concept of what's happening in social media. And he's had TED Talks where he talks about this stuff. And they had a journalist from the Philippines recently on one of their podcasts that spoke about this stuff. She was front lines, like seeing this, and they have a newspaper. They're trying to create a platform for journalists to fact check one another, to help this cross journalist, resource to combat what's happening. Her organization is training journalists in the front lines how to defeat misinformation and disinformation, and how to fight back against these algorithms that are 1,000 times smarter than a million times smarter than we'll ever be. We're going up against algorithms that were developed, 10 years ago, IBM Watson, that beat the world champion in chess, and, beat the guy who, the Jeopardy champion, like these algorithms, these machines are smarter, they're faster, and they go on forever. They don't have to sleep. So that's who we're going up against. What was the original question again? I feel like I get off these huge tangents.
On these little tangents. Well, I mean, so like for me, a lot of my background is kind of in marketing. And one of the reasons I've had to shift gears is because and this had nothing to do with my question. I don't remember my question, but there is a way that like at every level, like even small business owners and people like me who are just like doing social media advertising, like everyone is really encouraged to track clicks, to follow people around the internet, to see where they are, to use their data without really personalizing the issue. And I think that like when you zoom into that level and then you zoom out to what's happening in other countries that have, because I don't think that free basics is just in the Philippines, is it? Yeah, it's, yeah. And so like the implications of that, like understanding that we have a personal relationship that seems so benign, but then there's this other, and like talk about trigger words. Like we have been trained, I mean, since the Kennedy assassination, when the term conspiracy theorist was first, like, you know, they've been using that in newspapers to kind of, you know, discredit people. So like that's an early kind of analog example of one of the ways that we've been trained to be reactionary based on words. And now if you say conspiracy theory on Facebook, it's not even just the word, it's any of these things that fall under the umbrella. So there's like a level of media that's kind of participating and saying like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory that is playing into the hands of, you know, what is a conspiracy theory? It's this idea that there's some, you know, entity behind the curtain orchestrating, you know, our choices and orchestrating reality for us or something like that. And of course, fucking Facebook, Google, YouTube would not want us to know or not want us to react well to the term conspiracy theory. Because, you know, even if you don't believe in conspiracy theories in the government, there's so much evidence of what, you know, the data giants have been doing. And so like, it just seems really dystopian in a way that we have been like trained to look away from the scene of the crime when it's, you know, playing out right in front of us. And I think like maybe we'll end it on this note, which is a positive note. What do you believe your role of artist is in the information world and in the data world and online?
That's a really good question, because a lot of times I feel like I'm not doing enough. And for me, it really, as an artist, I have a platform. People look to artists during hard times. I mean, right now we're going through this pandemic, and artists, you know, are there. They're creating, they're processing through this. And for me, I've really taken it upon myself to utilize my platform and utilize the art that I create, digital art, physical art, and convey these messages and get the message out and get people engaged in talking about it. A few years ago, my partner and I, I'm part of a group, a digital media lab called Input Output. And really we're focused on helping people transition into the future, right? And what does that look like? So I like to educate, and I like to create experiences that put things in people's perspective or in their view, into their world, into their echo chamber. It may not already have been there through art, because art has that ability to be able to transcend social barriers that we've created. So I have friends, you know, I have millionaires on my friends list, and not to like gloat or anything, but like these are guys that I served with in the military, you know, and they've been friends with me, and they have ideologies that are so far from mine, but I'm able to connect with them through art. You know, they like my artwork, and then we're able to have those connections and continue that, you know, the relationship and look past the issues that we feel like we differ from, and, you know, connect on certain things. So art has that ability. And honestly, really just, like I said, just creating and processing through it as an individual, and really starting with myself. Like, I need to be that person that does just ask questions rather than being reactionary, you know, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love it so much. We also, I mean, another time, there's so much that we could delve into, but I would, you know, speaking of drug trade, we have a lot to talk about when it comes to the CIA and the United States government, but we'll say that for another time. But I appreciate you being on. Any last words? Like, do you have, I know you recommended 2 books at the beginning and a website. Is there like, could you just like rattle off like places people can look?
Yeah, so the Center for Humane Technology is one of the first places I would go. Their website's really intuitive. You can go on there. Their philosophy about what's going on right now is right on the front page. And they have a lot of links on like fact checking, good places to go if you really want to fact check some of the work that or the information you've received. Also, a book that I recently picked up. It's a big read. It's a dense book. It's called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. If you don't have a chance to read the book, just look her up on YouTube, and you'll see some of her videos and her talk. She talks a lot about this. And Jaron Lanier is another great thinker. Any of his books, really, I would definitely encourage people to look into. Also, just, you are your own resource as well. So like look within. When they say things like the cheesy, oh, meditate, do yoga, do things, journal, all these things, we act like it's fluff, but this is a way to externalize the things that you're receiving, to really be introspective, utilize art to process through some of the things that you've received. Don't just receive it and then imprint it as part of your identity, but understand, why is it this information is being presented to me? Question those things, like, where is this information coming from, and what good is it doing for me and for others? Question those things and process through them, write about it, meditate on it, stay healthy and positive, really. Those are your biggest resources.
Amen. And where can we follow you and Input Output?
Okay, so personally, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm Alex Ramos 8485. That's my tag. You can follow my digital work through Input Output. The IG link is at 1 input, 0 output. So it's like the 1 and the 0, or the I and the O are 1s and 0s. So it's Input Output.
Which is so cute and clever.
Right. All right, cool. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you later. I love you. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.